Sigmund Freud discovered the hidden map of the human unconscious mind, forever changing how we view our deepest desires and darkest fears. They called him the Copernicus of the mind, the destroyer of illusions. Sigmund Freud was a man who declared to all humanity that it is not the master in its own house. Instead, he said it is governed by dark and hidden instincts. He was a doctor who replaced the scalpel with words. He turned an ordinary couch into a tool for the dissection of the human soul. He was a scientist who proved that our dreams are not delusions. They are encrypted messages from our deepest, most hidden desires. But who was really this Viennese professor with his inseparable cigar? Who was this man whose ideas shocked the world and made an entire generation blush? Was he the greatest genius who discovered the map of the unconscious mind? Or was he an obsessed charlatan who destroyed the myth of childhood innocence by finding dark instincts within it? This story is about his journey. It is about how an ambitious young neurologist who dreamed of quick fame made a fatal mistake with cocaine. He tried to find a miracle cure, but found only tragedy and addiction. It is the story of the birth of psychoanalysis in the dim light of the office at number 19 Berggasse. It is about the scandalous theories that made friends and colleagues turn their backs on him. And it is about the dramatic break with his crown prince, Carl Gustav Jung. Finally, it is the story about the courage of an old man. For 16 years, he fought a torturous war against jaw cancer. It is about a man who watched the Nazis burn his books, calling him an enemy of the Reich. And at the end of his path, he asked his doctor to give him a lethal dose of morphine to leave this life on his own terms. To understand Sigmund Freud, you first have to understand the world that shaped him. Vienna, in the second half of the 19th century, was the capital of a huge and decaying Austro-Hungarian empire. It was a city of paradoxes. On the outside, there was the dazzling architecture of the Ringstrasse, the cafes, the music of Strauss, and strict Catholic etiquette. On the inside, it was a boiling pot of national conflicts and social inequality. Most importantly, it was a place of total and suffocating hypocrisy in matters of morality and sex. It was a completely buttoned-up society. Even piano legs were sometimes covered so they would not provoke indecent associations. It was in this atmosphere of repressed desires that psychoanalysis was born. He was born Sigismund Shlomo Freud on May 6, 1856. He came into the world in the small Moravian town of Freiburg, which is now Pribor in the Czech Republic. He was born into the family of a not very wealthy Jewish wool merchant named Jacob Freud. He was born with a caul, meaning part of the amniotic sac remained over his head. In popular beliefs, this was considered a sure sign of a great destiny and good luck. His mother was the young and energetic Amalia, who was 20 years younger than her husband. She blindly believed in the exceptional nature of her firstborn son. She called him her golden Siggy. This boundless and suffocating maternal love, along with her admiration, formed an unshakable self-confidence in him. This confidence would later allow him to stand alone against the entire scientific world. As he himself would write later, a man who has been the undisputed favorite of his mother keeps that feeling of a conqueror for his whole life. When the boy was 4 years old, his father's business went bankrupt. The family moved to Vienna, settling in the poor Jewish neighborhood of Leopoldstadt. Life there was cramped and difficult. A large family was crowded into a small apartment. Sigmund was joined by 5 sisters and 1 brother. But even in that cramped space, the status of the golden boy remained untouchable. Sigmund had his own room, or alcove. He was the only one allowed to use an oil lamp to study, while the others had to settle for candles. If Sigmund was studying, there had to be dead silence in the house. His sisters were even forbidden from studying music, because the sounds of the piano irritated the young genius. He grew up as a child prodigy. By age 12, he read Shakespeare fluently in English. He also mastered Greek, Latin, French, Italian, and Spanish, which he learned just to read Don Quixote in the original language. But his intellectual development went hand in hand with a feeling of deep social loneliness. Being Jewish in Catholic Vienna, Freud faced anti-Semitism from an early age. One time, his father told him a story. A Christian man knocked his new fur hat into the mud with a blow and shouted, "Get off the sidewalk, Jew." Little Sigmund asked, "And what did you do?" His father answered meekly, "I stepped into the street and picked up my hat." That submission from his father caused a burning shame and rage in Freud. He swore he would never be like that. His hero was not the biblical Moses, but the Carthaginian general Hannibal, a Semite who made Rome tremble. Freud dreamed of being a general or a minister. He wanted to be a man of power who would take revenge on Rome, which was a symbol of Catholic Vienna. But in Austria, Hungary, a military or political career was practically closed to a Jew. There were only two paths left for an ambitious young man: law or medicine. In 1873, at age 17, Freud entered the University of Vienna. Inspired by an essay by Goethe on nature and Darwin's theory of evolution, he chose medicine. But it was not because he wanted to heal people. He wanted to be a research scientist, to discover the secrets of nature, not to listen to the complaints of patients. His student years stretched out for 8 long years. He was in no rush to get his degree. Immersed in pure science, he worked in the Institute of Physiology under the direction of Ernst Brücke. Brücke was a severe and disciplined scientist who believed that any living organism is simply a mechanism that works according to the laws of physics and chemistry. It was Brücke who became the strict father figure in science for Freud, training him in ruthless thoroughness. The first scientific work of the future father of psychoanalysis was surprisingly ordinary and even comical. Freud got a scholarship to travel to Trieste, to the marine zoology station. His task was to solve a riddle that had tormented biologists since the time of Aristotle. How do eels reproduce? Scientists could not find the sexual organs in eels. Young Freud spent months cutting open more than 400 eels, trying to find the testicles of the males. It was dirty and meticulous work. He spent hours sitting at the microscope, dissecting slippery fish. In the end, he failed. He could never conclusively prove the presence of male organs in the studied samples. This episode, although it seems funny, is very revealing. Even then, Freud was obsessed with the search for the hidden and invisible source of life, in this case, the sexual function, hidden deep within the organism. His failure with the eels only strengthened his desire to find the truth somewhere else, in the nervous system. When he returned to Vienna, he dedicated himself to neuroanatomy. He became an expert in microscopy, studying the nerve cells and neurons of lower fish. He made discoveries, wrote articles, and invented new methods for staining tissues. He was happy in the laboratory. He saw his future as a desk scientist, a professor who would spend his life behind a microscope, far from people. But destiny had other plans. In 1882, at age 26, Freud met Martha Bernays, a young woman from an intellectual Jewish family. It was love at first sight, but Martha was poor and Freud was poor. A scientific career in those times did not pay well. Professor positions were occupied for decades, and they were rarely given to Jews. His mentor, Ernst Brücke, called him in for an honest conversation. "You have talent, Freud," he told him, "but you have no money. You cannot afford the luxury of being a scientist. You have to feed a family. Go to work at the hospital." It was the end of a dream. Freud was forced to leave his beloved laboratory and come down from the heaven of pure science to the earth of practical medicine. He got a position as an assistant doctor at the Vienna General Hospital. For him, it felt like an exile. He hated the sight of blood and suffering. He despised dealing with sick people. However, it was exactly this forced step that led him to the discovery that would change the world. Working in different departments, he finally arrived at the Department of Nervous Diseases. Neurology at that time was a descriptive science. Doctors knew how to brilliantly diagnose where the brain lesion was, but they had no idea how to cure it. Freud was thirsty for fame and the money to marry Martha. Their engagement lasted 4 agonizing years. He started looking for a way to achieve a quick breakthrough. He needed a miracle cure that would make him famous. In 1884, he stumbled upon an article by a German military doctor about a little-known alkaloid extracted from the leaves of a South American plant called coca. Freud decided he had found the philosopher's stone of medicine. He ordered a batch of an expensive white powder, cocaine. This started one of the darkest and most dangerous chapters of his life. It was a chapter that could have destroyed his career, but instead, it became the prologue to the birth of psychoanalysis. In the spring of 1884, 28-year-old Sigmund Freud was a man obsessed with a single idea. He wanted to escape poverty and anonymity. He worked at the Vienna General Hospital and earned practically nothing. His wedding to Martha was constantly postponed due to a lack of funds. His scientific career was stalled after his failure with the eels. He needed a breakthrough. He needed a discovery that would instantly make his name famous. He found it in an article by a German military doctor describing the effects of an alkaloid extracted from coca leaves. Little was known about cocaine in Europe. It was an expensive, rare, and understudied substance. Freud, who had the intuition of a gambler, decided this was his chance. He ordered 1 gram of cocaine from the pharmaceutical company Merck. At the time, that cost a fortune, money he had borrowed with great difficulty. When he tasted the crystalline white powder for the first time, Freud was shocked. His chronic fatigue disappeared. The depression that had tormented him for years was replaced by incredible energy, mental clarity, and self-confidence. He felt like a titan. "I feel like I can move mountains," he wrote. Blinded by euphoria, Freud made the classic mistake of a researcher. He took a subjective sensation as a scientific fact. He decided he had found the magic bullet. He thought it was the ideal remedy for depression, fatigue, indigestion, and even seasickness. Most importantly, he was convinced that cocaine was absolutely harmless and did not cause addiction. He began his cocaine crusade. He consumed it himself regularly, in small doses, to increase his work capacity. He started handing it out to everyone. He sent powder to his fiancée Martha, so she would have color in her cheeks and a good mood. He invited his sisters to try it. He distributed it among his colleagues at the hospital. He became the apostle of the new drug. In the summer of 1884, he wrote and published an article called On Coca. It was not a dry medical report, but an enthusiastic anthem. Freud wrote about the miraculous stimulating effect and claimed that cocaine had no side effects. He recommended it as a cure for everything. The article sparked interest, but true glory escaped him by a fatal chance. Freud noticed that cocaine caused numbness in the tongue and the mucous membrane of the mouth. He shared this observation with his colleague, the ophthalmologist Karl Koller, but Freud did not give it much importance. He was in a hurry to go to Hamburg to see his fiancée Martha, whom he had not seen for a year. Love turned out to be stronger than scientific instinct. While Freud was enjoying his vacation with his fiancée, Karl Koller carried out the decisive experiment. He applied a cocaine solution to the eye of a frog, and then to his own eye. The eye lost sensitivity. Koller caused a revolution. Until that moment, eye surgeries were done, while the patient was fully awake and feeling everything. Patients screamed in pain, or they had to be put to sleep with chloroform, which was dangerous. Koller discovered local anesthesia. When Freud returned to Vienna, he discovered that Koller was a world celebrity and a benefactor of humanity. Meanwhile, Freud was left with nothing. He was only the man who suggested the idea, but did not carry it out. It was a painful blow to his pride, but the true tragedy was yet to come. It involved his best friend and mentor, the brilliant scientist Ernst von Fleischl-Marxow. Fleischl was a genius, an aristocrat, and a hero to Freud, but his life was a living hell. While working in the morgue, he cut his thumb and it got infected. They had to amputate the finger, but neuromas formed on the scar. These growths of nerve tissue caused him unbearable, infernal pain. Fleischl lived on morphine. He was a severe addict, and his personality and career were falling apart under the effects of the opiates. Freud, driven by the best intentions and his blind faith in cocaine, decided to save his friend. He had read in American magazines that cocaine helped treat morphine addiction. He began treating Fleischl, prescribing him large doses of cocaine as a substitution therapy. At first, a miracle seemed to happen. Fleischl stopped using morphine and became energetic and active. Freud was triumphant. He thought he had found the cure for drug addiction. But very soon, something terrible was revealed. Fleischl was not cured. He had simply traded one addiction for another, an even more terrible one. Soon, he started consuming both. The huge doses of cocaine, up to 1 gram a day given by Freud, caused a rapid degradation of his personality and severe psychosis. Fleischl started hallucinating. He felt like thousands of white snakes and insects were crawling under his skin. It is a classic symptom of cocaine delirium, the feeling of deep crawling on the skin. Freud spent his nights by his friend's bed. He watched him go crazy with pain and terror, scratching his skin until it bled, trying to pull out the imaginary snakes. Freud saw a brilliant intellect turn into ruins. And the most terrifying part was that he understood he had done it. With his own hands and his miracle cure, he had accelerated his friend's end. Fleischl died in torment, in a state of total disintegration. It was a devastating blow. At the same time, reports started appearing in the medical press about cases of addiction and death from cocaine all over the world. The euphoria gave way to panic. The German doctor Albrecht Erlenmeyer published a scathing article. He called cocaine the third scourge of humanity after alcohol and morphine. He accused Freud of having unleashed this demon. Freud's reputation was destroyed. They called him an irresponsible adventurer, a charlatan, and a man who risked his patients' lives for fame. The Viennese medical community turned its back on him. At the hospital, they looked at him with disgust. Instead of glory, he got shame. Instead of wealth, he got debts. Freud himself managed to stop consuming cocaine, but with great difficulty. Fortunately, he did not develop a strong physical dependence like Fleischl did, but the feeling of guilt stayed with him forever. He would later call this period his wild phase. However, this catastrophe was exactly the turning point. After failing to cure the soul and nerves through chemistry, the scalpel, and powders, Freud became disappointed with traditional materialistic medicine. He understood that the human psyche is not just a collection of neurons that can be manipulated with a substance. It is an abyss full of demons that cannot be put to sleep with cocaine. Having lost his reputation as a physiological scientist, he was forced to find a new path. He had nothing left to lose. In 1885, fleeing from the shame and gossip of Vienna, he applied for a scholarship to travel to Paris. He went to the Salpêtrière clinic to work with the famous doctor Jean-Martin Charcot. Charcot treated hysteria with hypnosis. For Freud, that was an entry into another dimension. He traveled to Paris as a failure, known as the cocaine doctor. But it would be there, in the Parisian morgue of souls, where he would find the key to the creation of psychoanalysis. In October 1885, Sigmund Freud arrived in Paris. He was running away from Vienna, leaving behind the ruins of his reputation after the cocaine scandal, his debts, and a lot of uncertainty. He was going to the capital of France not as a tourist, but as a pilgrim in search of the new deity of medicine. His destination was the Salpêtrière Hospital. It was a gigantic and gloomy complex of buildings. An old gunpowder factory turned into an asylum for the mentally ill, epileptics, and prostitutes. It was a true city of pain within Paris. It housed more than 5,000 women rejected by society. Dr. Jean-Martin Charcot ruled this kingdom of madness. Charcot was a superstar of 19th century medicine, the Napoleon of neuroses. Viennese doctors considered hysteria the most common and mysterious disease of the time, either a simulation or a purely female disease related to the uterus. The word hysteria comes from the Greek word hystera, meaning uterus. But Charcot approached it as a scientist. He claimed that hysteria was a real disease of the nervous system with its own laws and symptoms. Freud, who was used to the silence of laboratories, was shocked by what he saw. Charcot had turned science into theatre. Every Tuesday, he gave his famous public lectures. The Parisian elite gathered in the Grand Hall. There were doctors, writers, journalists, and high society ladies. The patients were brought out onto the stage and often carried in. They were the famous hysterics of the Salpêtrière. Charcot, who looked like a Roman senator and had a hypnotic gaze, performed miracles with them. Through hypnosis, he could cause a totally healthy woman to have complete paralysis, blindness, or an attack indistinguishable from an epileptic one. And then, with a single word, he eliminated those symptoms. Women who for years were considered incurable and paralyzed would stand up and walk under hypnosis. For Freud, raised in the strict materialism of the German school, where they only believed in what could be cut with a scalpel. This looked like magic. But it was scientific magic. Charcot showed him a revolutionary idea. The cause of the disease might not be in the body, nor in the nerves, nor in bacteria. The cause could be in an idea. The idea of paralysis, planted in the consciousness, causes real physical paralysis. It is always a genital thing. Charcot once said this quietly during a reception while discussing a case of hysteria. Freud heard that phrase, and it burned into his soul. It became the seed for his future theory of sexuality, even though Charcot himself did not develop that topic publicly. Freud spent 4 months in Paris. He translated Charcot's lectures into German and got the right to speak personally with the master. He left Paris a different man. He no longer wanted to look at brain slices through a microscope. He wanted to look into the soul. He understood that the human mind is an iceberg, and hypnosis allows you to look underwater. Returning to Vienna in 1886, Freud finally married his faithful Martha Bernays. He needed to feed his family, so he opened a private practice as a neuropathology doctor. He rented an apartment at number 19 Bergasse. This address would become the most famous in the history of psychology. On Easter Sunday, 1886, he presented a report to the Vienna Medical Society. He told them what he had seen in Paris. He declared that hysteria not only occurs in women, but also in men. This was an insult to patriarchal Vienna. It was believed that man, the supreme creation, could not suffer from a female disease of the uterus. He also spoke about hypnosis. The reaction was cold and hostile. The old professors, the pillars of Viennese medicine, made fun of him. One of them, the famous surgeon Theodor Meinert, openly called Freud a charlatan and kicked him out of his laboratory. Freud found himself isolated again. Patients did not come to his office. His colleagues stopped saying hello to him. Desperate, he tried to apply Charcot's methods. He bought a couch, that very famous one, covered with an oriental rug given to him by a patient. He started hypnotizing his few clients. But here, he ran into a problem. Freud was a bad hypnotist. He did not have Charcot's charisma. Many patients simply did not go into a trance. Others faked it. Some were cured for a day, but then the symptoms came back. He felt like a fraud. Working with hypnosis feels like magic tricks and has something humiliating about it, he confessed. And then, his only friend and protector, the respected Dr. Joseph Breuer, came to his rescue. Breuer told him the strange case of a patient of his named Bertha Pappenheim. In the clinical history, she appears under the pseudonym Anna O. Anna O suffered from severe hysteria. She had paralysis of her limbs, a refusal to drink water, hydrophobia, hallucinations, and a loss of her native language. Breuer noticed something amazing. When Anna, in a state of light trance, or simply in a trusting chat, told him her fantasies and fears, the symptoms disappeared. Anna herself called it the talking cure. Jokingly, she also called it chimney sweeping. For example, she could not drink water because she felt disgusted. In a trance, she remembered and told Breuer that she had seen her companion's disgusting dog drinking from her glass. She expressed her repressed anger and disgust, which she had forgotten in her conscious state. As soon as she said it out loud, the hydrophobia disappeared forever. She asked for water. For Freud, this was a revelation, a lightning bolt in the dark. He understood the mechanism. A traumatic event or a forbidden desire does not disappear from memory. It is repressed into the unconscious, into the basement of the soul, but it does not die there. It turns into energy that looks for a way out and finds it in the form of illness. It becomes paralysis, a cough, or blindness. The body screams what the mouth keeps quiet. The doctor's job is not to give pills or give orders under hypnosis, like stand up and walk. The doctor's job is to become an archaeologist. They must dig up that repressed affection. They must force the patient to remember it, to relive it and express it with words, to bring it back from the unconscious to the consciousness. And then the symptom will disappear. Freud began to experiment. He gave up hypnosis. Instead, he invented a new technique. He asked the patient to lie down on the couch to relax. He sat at the head of the couch, out of the patient's line of sight. Later, he would confess, I simply cannot stand being stared at for 8 hours a day. He asked the patient to do a simple but incredibly difficult thing, to say everything that came to their mind. Absolutely everything, without censorship, without filtering, without shame, any nonsense, vulgarity, or fragment of thought. This was the method of free association. Freud discovered that if a person stops controlling their speech, their thoughts inevitably start to flutter around their main and hidden pain, like a moth around a lamp. In slips of the tongue, in casual words, and in pauses, the unconscious breaks through. Thus, in the quiet office at number 19 Bergasse, behind tightly closed curtains, a new science was born. Freud stopped being a neurologist who treated nerves. He became the first listener in the world. He listened to what polite society in Vienna was forbidden to even think about. He heard about hatred for parents, sexual fantasies, the fear of death, and childhood traumas. But the more he listened, the more terrifying the picture that opened before him became. He began to understand that at the root of almost all the neuroses of his patients, there was not simply a trauma, but a trauma of a sexual nature. And most of the time, that trauma had its roots deep in childhood. In 1896, he used the term psychoanalysis for the first time. He was ready to challenge the world. He declared that the human being is not a rational creature created in the image of God. Instead, the human is a battlefield between animal instincts and social demands. But to prove this, he had to undertake the most difficult journey, the journey to the depths of his own dreams. In October 1896, an event occurred in the life of Sigmund Freud, who was already 40 years old, that became the catalyst for the birth of his main theory. His father, Jacob Freud, died. Sigmund's relationship with his father was always complex. It was woven with love, respect, and a deep, hidden disappointment. Remember the story about the hat in the mud? His father's death plunged Freud into a very severe crisis. He fell into a depression. He suffered from cardiac neuroses, anxiety, and unexplained fears. He realized that he himself suffered from the same things he treated in his patients. But Freud did not have an analyst whose couch he could lie on. He had to become his own doctor. He started an unprecedented experiment in the history of science, self-analysis. Every morning, when he woke up, he meticulously wrote down his dreams. For science, at the end of the 19th century, this was nonsense. Serious scientists considered dreams simply as brain noise. They thought it was a chaotic activity of neurons without any meaning. Mystics considered them messages from the gods. Freud, however, proposed a revolutionary third hypothesis. A dream is not a delusion or a prophecy. It is a psychic act with a meaning. It is the royal road to knowledge of the unconscious. He discovered that dreams speak in a language of symbols. What we see in a dream, the manifest content, is a masquerade, a code. Behind it hides the true meaning, the latent content. These are our repressed desires, fears, and traumas. Why does the mind encrypt them? Because those desires are often unacceptable, shameful, or terrible for our conscious mind. Even in a dream, a sensor works in the person's head. It is a defense mechanism that does not let the pure truth pass through, forcing it to wear masks. The starting point for his book was a dream he had on the night of July 23rd to 24th, 1895. He was resting at the Bellevue Villa near Vienna. It is the famous dream of Irma's injection. In the dream, Freud saw a real patient of his named Irma. Her treatment was not going very well. In the dream, she complained of a sore throat. Freud examined her and saw terrible white spots and scabs in her throat. At that moment, his medical colleagues appeared in the dream. One of them, Dr. Otto, gave Irma an injection with a dirty syringe. He gave her a preparation that smelled like trimethylamine. When he woke up, Freud did not just dismiss the nightmare. He subjected it to a brutal analysis. He took the dream apart in detail, like clockwork, and understood the meaning. The day before, a real colleague named Otto had criticized Freud's treatment methods. The dream was the response of a wounded ego. In the dream, Freud shifted the blame for Irma's illness onto the patient herself, saying she would not open her mouth. He also blamed his colleague Otto, who gave the dirty injection. Freud's conclusion was amazing. A dream is the fulfillment of a desire. Even in a nightmare, even in an anxiety dream, our unconscious tries to fulfill some hidden desire. In this case, it was Freud's desire to justify himself, to remove the blame for a medical error, and to take revenge for the criticism. But his self-analysis took him even deeper. It took him to basements of memory so dark that it was scary to look. Analyzing his childhood memories and his dreams, Freud reached a conclusion that shocked him. He discovered inside himself the respectable son, forgotten childhood jealousy toward his father, and an attraction to his mother. He remembered his childhood, when his father seemed like a powerful rival who stole his mother's attention from him. He realized that the desire to eliminate the father and totally possess the mother is not a unique perversion. It is a universal stage in the development of the human psyche. He found confirmation of this in Sophocles' great tragedy, Oedipus Rex. In that story, the hero kills his father and marries his mother. Thus was born the concept of the Oedipus complex, the cornerstone of psychoanalysis. This required incredible intellectual bravery. To confess to himself the subconscious desire for the death of his father, whom he had just buried and mourned, was an act of supreme honesty. Freud used himself as a lab rat, opening his own abscesses to understand the structure of all human beings. In 1899, the work was finished. The book received the title, The Interpretation of Dreams. Freud knew he had written a masterpiece. His publisher knew it too, and used a marketing trick. Even though the book came out in November 1899, they put the date 1900 on the cover. Freud wanted his work to open the new century. In this book, he described the topography of the psyche. He showed that consciousness is just a thin film on the surface of the ocean of the unconscious. He described the mechanisms of dream work. One is condensation, when an image in a dream combines features of several people. Another is displacement, when the main emotion is transferred to an insignificant object. He declared that dreams are the guardians of sleep. They allow us to discharge psychic tension without waking up. Freud expected an explosion. He expected the scientific world to be shocked. But instead of an explosion, there was silence. The book failed. In the first 6 years, only 351 copies were sold. The reviews in medical journals were devastating or mocking. Psychiatrists called it an unscientific fairy tale, like reading coffee grounds. The idea that dreams have meaning seemed like a return to medieval superstitions. And the idea that they are based on sexual and aggressive desires caused disgust in the Victorian public. Freud found himself isolated. They called him an eccentric, a pornographer, a man obsessed with dirty thoughts. His patients left. His colleagues stopped greeting him. He was already over 40 years old. He was a father of 6 children, but his career seemed destroyed. He wrote to his friend Wilhelm Fliess, the only person who supported him in those years. He maintained an intense correspondence with Fliess, which was part of his self-analysis. "I am completely alone," he wrote. "My discoveries are a voice crying in the desert." But Freud had the stubbornness of a fanatic. He knew he was right. He kept working, seeing patients, and writing. He believed that time was on his side. And he was not wrong. Slowly, very slowly, a circle of followers began to form around his doctrine. The interpretation of dreams became a ticking time bomb. This book did not just propose a new theory. It changed the way humanity sees itself. It destroyed the illusion of the human being as a rational creature. It showed that inside each of us, under a thin layer of civilization, lives an ancient, irrational beast, full of passions. And that beast comes out every night when we close our eyes. Freud opened Pandora's box. And, as he himself would later say with bitter irony, "I bring you the plague, and they do not even know it." In 1905, Sigmund Freud published a work that definitively turned him from an eccentric scientist into an outcast and an enemy of society. The book was titled 3 Essays on the Theory of Sexuality. If the interpretation of dreams was met with silence, this book caused an outburst of indignation, the echo of which is still heard today. Vienna, at the beginning of the 20th century, was the capital of puritanical morality. Sex was a taboo. It was not talked about. It was hidden, and it caused shame. Official science and the church claimed that sexual desire awoke only at puberty and served exclusively for reproduction within a legal marriage. Anything outside of those limits was considered a perversion, a disease, or a sin. Freud, with cold, surgical precision, destroyed this myth. He introduced the concept of libido, the psychic energy that lies at the base of all human aspirations. He declared that libido is not just the desire for physical closeness. It is the fuel of life, that force that pushes human beings to create, build, love, and kill. But the most shocking part was his claim that this energy does not appear at age 15. It is born with the person. Freud stated that a baby is not an innocent angel, as people used to believe. He described the child as a being full of instinctual desires and aspirations for pleasure. Society then harshly represses these desires through education. He called this polymorphous perversity. This term caused an attack of rage among his contemporaries. To claim that an innocent child possesses dark and secret instincts was an unheard of blasphemy against morality. The reaction was instant and cruel. At medical congresses, when Freud's name was mentioned, professors would hit the table with their fists and shout. They called his doctrine filth, pornography disguised as science, and the Viennese sewer. A famous German neurologist, in a fit of rage, declared that Freud's case was not a topic for scientific discussion, but for the moral police. The anti-Semitic press happily took up the theme. They called psychoanalysis a Jewish science destined to corrupt Christian values. Freud found himself in total isolation. His old friends turned their backs on him. Patients pulled their children out of his office. Even Emperor Franz Joseph, according to rumors, expressed his displeasure. But Freud did not take a single step back. He possessed the courage of a fanatic, sure of his truth. He wrote, "You can insult me, but you cannot ignore the facts. I only opened the lid of the sewer, and a smell came out that you do not like, but it is the smell of your own essence." In this atmosphere of a besieged fortress, a circle of faithful disciples began to form around Freud. Since 1902, every Wednesday night, a small group of people gathered in his apartment at number 19 Burgas. They met in a waiting room decorated with antiques. They called themselves the Wednesday Psychological Society. They were strange meetings. The air in the room was grey, with tobacco smoke. Freud and his guests smoked cigars non-stop. There was black coffee on the table. The attendees were not academic heavyweights. They were outcast doctors, writers, and intellectuals who, like Freud, felt like strangers in official science. They included Alfred Adler, Wilhelm Steckel, and Max Kahane. The atmosphere felt like the meetings of a secret revolutionary cell or a religious sect. Freud was the undisputed leader, the prophet of the new faith. They discussed patient cases, analyzed their own dreams, and debated the nature of neuroses. There, among the cigar smoke, the language of the new science was forged. Freud demanded total honesty and loyalty from his disciples. Psychoanalysis was becoming not just a treatment method, but a movement. It was a cause that had to be served. Little by little, the movement began to spread outside of Vienna. In 1907, an event occurred that Freud considered his greatest victory. He was visited by a brilliant young psychiatrist from Zurich named Carl Gustav Jung. The importance of this event is hard to overestimate. Until then, psychoanalysis was a Jewish affair, a narrow circle of Jewish Viennese doctors. Jung was Swiss, Protestant, the son of a pastor. He worked at the prestigious Berg-Holzli State Clinic under the direction of the famous Eugen Bleuler. Bleuler was the man who invented the term schizophrenia. The union with the Zurich school meant that psychoanalysis left the ghetto and became an international science. Freud and Jung talked for 13 straight hours. Freud was fascinated. He saw Jung as his heir, the crown prince who would carry the banner of psychoanalysis further when Freud himself was gone. He called him his Joshua, who would lead the people to the promised land of psychiatry. In 1909, the leap to the global level occurred. Freud and Jung were invited to the United States, to Clark University, to give a series of lectures. It was their first official recognition. Standing on the deck of the ship, approaching New York, looking at the Statue of Liberty, Freud, according to legend, turned to Jung. With dark irony, he said, They do not know we are bringing them the plague. By plague, he meant the truth about human nature. The truth that civilization is a thin crust over a volcano of instincts. That religion is a collective neurosis, an illusion created by man to protect himself from the fear of the forces of nature and death. That culture is built on the repression of the libido, and that this very repression is the cause of all our neuroses and misfortunes. In the United States, Freud's lectures were a huge success. The New World, more open and pragmatic, received the ideas of psychoanalysis with more enthusiasm than old Europe. Freud returned to Vienna triumphant. The movement grew. The International Psychoanalytical Association was created. But along with the growth came divisions. The Wednesday Society became a battlefield of ambitions. Alfred Adler, one of the first disciples, began to question Freud's main dogma, which was the primacy of sexuality. Adler claimed that the main driving force of man is not the libido, but the will to power and the desire to overcome the inferiority complex. For Freud, this was not a simple scientific disagreement. It was a betrayal. Freud was an authoritarian leader. He considered psychoanalysis his child, his creation, and he did not tolerate anyone distorting it. After harsh arguments, Adler was forced to leave the society, taking a group of supporters with him. It was the first schism, but not the last. Freud reacted to this by creating the Secret Committee. It was a deeply conspiratorial group of his 7 most faithful disciples, including Ernest Jones, Sandor Ferenczi, and Otto Rank. Freud gave each of them identical rings with ancient gems, which they wore as a sign of belonging to the order. The task of the committee was to protect the purity of the doctrine and defend Freud from attacks. By the 1910s, Freud had become world famous, but he felt like a lonely leader. He was surrounded by enemies on the outside and heretics on the inside. He had built an empire of reason, but the foundations of that empire were beginning to creak. And the most terrible blow was being prepared by the one he loved the most, his adopted son, Carl Gustav Jung. The relationship between Sigmund Freud and Carl Gustav Jung was never a simple professional collaboration. From the beginning, it was an intense and emotionally charged romance between 2 great minds. It was full of mutual admiration, but doomed to a tragic end, right out of the script of Freudian theory itself. It was the script of the Oedipus complex, where the son inevitably must rebel against the father and symbolically kill him to obtain his freedom. For Freud, Jung's appearance in 1907 was a gift of destiny. Freud, who was already over 50, felt isolated in Vienna, surrounded by anti-Semitic enemies and conservative critics. Jung was everything Freud was not. He was young, tall, physically powerful, a self-confident Aryan, and the son of a Swiss Protestant pastor. He did not carry the stigma of Jewish science. Freud immediately placed all his hopes in him. He officially named Jung his eldest son, his crown prince, and his successor. "When I die," he said, "it will be Jung who rules this kingdom." For 32-year-old Jung, Freud became a substitute father. Jung had a difficult relationship with his own father, a weak priest full of doubts. He saw in Freud the figure of a patriarch, a man who was not afraid to look into the abyss of the human soul. Their correspondence from the early years is full of expressions of love and devotion. However, the seeds of discord were planted in the very foundation of their alliance. Freud was a strict materialist and atheist. For him, psychoanalysis was a strictly scientific discipline based on biology and instincts. Jung, on the other hand, was a mystic by nature. He was interested not only in repressed sexual desires, but also in mythology, religion, alchemy, and spiritualism. He believed that the human soul is not just a warehouse of dirty secrets, but a bridge to something higher and transcendent. The first serious crack appeared during their famous trip to the United States in 1909. They spent 7 weeks together on a ship, analyzing each other's dreams every day. It was a dangerous experiment. Analysis requires inequality. One lies down, the other listens. Here, 2 giants were trying to analyze each other. One day, Jung told Freud a dream. To interpret it, he needed some intimate details of Freud's personal life. But Freud, sensing a threat to his authority, coldly refused. He said, I cannot risk my authority. At that moment, as Jung would later remember, Freud lost his authority completely. Jung saw that for his master, power and hierarchy were more important than truth. In turn, Jung told Freud a dream in which he went down to the basement of an old house and found 2 old skulls there. Freud, obsessed with his theory, immediately asked whose skulls they were. "Which of your relatives do you wish were dead?" he asked. He was trying to fit the dream into the framework of the Oedipus complex, the desire to kill the father rival. But Jung knew the dream meant something else. It was the discovery of the collective unconscious. He understood that the basement was not a personal past, but the past of all humanity. It represented the archetypes that live in each of us. Freud called Jung's interest in myths and archetypes the black mud of occultism, which threatened to flood his science. The conflict grew. Freud demanded from Jung a dogmatic loyalty to the theory of sexuality and libido. He begged him, "Promise me that you will never give up the sexual theory," he said. "It is the most important bastion. We must turn it into a dogma, into an unassailable fortress." Jung was shocked by the word dogma. For him, science could not be a religion with dogmas. He replied, "A fortress? Against whom?" Freud answered, "Against the black tide of occultism." The break became inevitable when, in 1912, Jung published his book Transformations and Symbols of the Libido. In it, he redefined the concept of libido. He declared that it is not just sexual energy, but a general vital energy that can manifest itself in creativity, religion, and the spiritual search. For Freud, this was not a simple scientific error. It was heresy. It was the betrayal of the son who rejects the teachings of the father. The climax of their personal drama involved 2 incidents where Freud fainted. They looked like scenes from a Greek tragedy. The first happened in 1909 in Bremen, before sailing to the United States. Jung enthusiastically started talking about bog bodies, which were ancient mummies found in the peat bogs of northern Europe. Freud suddenly became furious. He accused Jung of subconsciously wishing for his death by talking about corpses, and then he fainted. The second case, even more dramatic, happened in 1912 at a congress in Munich. They were having lunch at the Park Hotel. The conversation turned to the Egyptian pharaoh Akhenaten, who erased his father's name from monuments to establish a new religion. Freud once again saw in this an allusion to himself and Jung. He saw Jung as the son who destroys the father. He stared at Jung for a long time and again lost consciousness, slipping out of his chair. Jung, tall and strong, picked up the small professor in his arms and carried him to the sofa. At that moment, when the father lay helpless in the arms of the son, the symbolic murder was completed. When he came to, Freud said, "How sweet it must be to die." But his love for Jung died that very day. Their correspondence turned into a duel. Freud became cold and sarcastic. Jung, tired of the role of an obedient disciple, exploded. In January 1913, he wrote Freud a letter full of fury and bitterness that put an end to their relationship. He accused Freud of acting not like a scientist, but like a prophet who fears losing his flock. "You treat your students like patients," Jung wrote. "You classify anyone who disagrees with you as neurotic. I am not your patient. If you want to be respected, stop playing the father. I do not wish to hear any more of your reproaches." Freud responded with a brief note, proposing to end their personal relations. It was a divorce. The consequences of the break were devastating for both of them. Freud took it as a very severe personal loss. He felt betrayed and alone again. To protect his child, psychoanalysis, he closed ranks even tighter with his secret committee, handing out rings to the faithful disciples. He wrote the article, "Contribution to the History of the Psychoanalytic Movement." In it, he publicly excommunicated Jung from the Church of Psychoanalysis, declaring his ideas unscientific. He became even harder and more intolerant of dissent. For Jung, the break marked the beginning of a profound spiritual crisis that lasted 6 years. He called it his confrontation with the unconscious. He found himself isolated. He lost his job as editor of the Psychoanalytic Journal and his position as professor. He was on the verge of psychosis. Terrible visions began to haunt him. Day and night he saw rivers of blood flooding Europe. He heard voices. He saw images of a dying civilization. He thought he was going crazy, that his own theory was destroying his brain. He started writing down his hallucinations and drawing mandalas in the Red Book. It was a mysterious diary that would not be published for almost 100 years. But what Jung thought were symptoms of his personal madness turned out to be a terrible prophecy of a collective nightmare. In August 1914, Jung's visions of seas of blood came true. The First World War began. The world that Freud knew, the world of bourgeois stability, faith in progress, and reason, collapsed. Freud's sons went to the front. Civilization itself seemed determined to confirm the darkest theories of the Viennese professor, that under the thin crust of culture hides a wild beast thirsty for murder and destruction. The era of the Golden Siggy was over. The era of Thanatos, the death drive, was beginning. The First World War was not just a humanitarian catastrophe for Freud. It was a dark confirmation of his most pessimistic theories. Seeing how the civilized nations of Europe enthusiastically wiped each other out in the trenches using gas and machine guns, he realized something. He realized that his early theory, which put the sexual desire, or libido, at the center, was incomplete. Sex is life, and what he saw around him was pure death. In 1920, after the death of millions of people, Freud published the work Beyond the Pleasure Principle. In it, he introduced the concept that would become the final chord of his philosophy, Thanatos, or the death drive. He declared that in every human being, along with the instinct of life, or eros, lives an ancient and dark instinct of destruction. It is the desire to return to the state of non-existence, to turn living matter back into dead matter. The war was not an accident, but a collective discharge of this instinct. Man is not a kind creature corrupted by society. Man is an aggressive animal that society barely manages to contain. But the war against death was not only fought on the fields of Europe, it was also fought in Freud's own body. In 1923, at the age of 67, Freud, a heavy smoker who consumed 20 cigars a day, discovered a painful tumor in his mouth. The diagnosis was terrible: cancer of the jaw and palate. The doctors did not give him even a couple of years to live, but Freud lived 16 more. They were 16 years of continuous and unimaginable torture. He had a first operation to remove part of his jaw and palate. The operation went badly. There was a hemorrhage, and he almost died. In total, during those years, he would undergo 33 operations. So that he could speak and eat, they made him a special prosthesis that he called the Monster. It was a bulky device made of rubber and metal that had to be inserted into his mouth. The prosthesis rubbed against the wounds that would not heal, causing him constant pain. It made it hard for him to speak and deformed his facial features. Eating became an ordeal for Freud. A bad smell of rotting meat came from him. Because of this, his beloved Chow Chow dog, whom he adored, stopped coming near him. This broke his heart more than the disease itself. But Freud refused strong painkillers. He only took aspirin. He said, "I prefer to think in torment than not to think at all." He wanted to keep his mind clear until the end. In the intervals between operations, he would struggle to open his mouth to insert his inseparable cigar. He never stopped smoking, even when his jaw was held open with forceps. He continued to see patients and write books. It was exactly during those years of pain that he wrote his most important works about culture and religion. While Freud's body was being destroyed from the inside, his world was being destroyed from the outside. The Nazis came to power in Germany. In 1933, book bonfires burned in Berlin. The works of Einstein, Marx, Kafka, and, of course, Freud were thrown into the fire. The Nazis declared that psychoanalysis was Jewish pornography that destroyed the spirit. When Freud was told about this, he reacted with his characteristic sarcasm and bitter optimism. "What progress?" he said. "In the Middle Ages, they would have burned me. Now they are satisfied with burning my books." He did not understand that the book bonfires were only the prelude to the ovens for people. Freud stubbornly refused to leave Vienna. He was old, sick, and attached to his home. He did not believe that Austria would fall. He, the great analyst of human nature, underestimated the force of the collective madness that he himself had described. The awakening came on March 12, 1938. Hitler announced the Anschluss, the annexation of Austria. Nazi tanks rolled into Vienna to the cheers of the crowd. The apartment at number 19, Burgas, the homeland of psychoanalysis, was right in the center of hell. SA stormtroopers burst into the house. They confiscated money and passports and threatened the old professor. Freud received them with an icy calm, looking at them as clinical cases of aggression. But the real terror arrived a few days later. The Gestapo arrested his favorite daughter, Anna Freud. They took her away for questioning. Anna was not just his daughter. She was his nurse, his secretary, his intellectual heir, and his only link to the world. During the whole day she was away, Freud sat in his study, smoking continuously, staring at the wall. He had given Anna a poison so she could commit suicide if they started to torture her. Fortunately, Anna was released thanks to the intervention of the American ambassador. At that moment, Freud broke. He understood. They had to run away. "It is time to die in freedom," he said. Salvation came in the form of his student and protector, the French Princess Marie Bonaparte, the great-granddaughter of Napoleon. She paid the Nazis a gigantic ransom, the flight tax of the Reich, for the chance to get Freud and his immediate family out. On June 4, 1938, Sigmund Freud, his wife Martha, and his daughter Anna boarded the Orient Express to Paris and from there to London. Upon leaving, Freud was forced to sign a humiliating document declaring that the German authorities had treated him with total respect. According to legend, he added at the bottom, "I can heartily recommend the Gestapo to anyone, but this escape had a terrible price." Freud was able to get his wife and children out, but he was forced to leave his 4 elderly sisters in Vienna. The Nazis did not let them leave. A few years later, all 4 of Sigmund Freud's sisters, Rosa, Marie, Adolphine, and Pauline, would die in the gas chambers of the concentration camps. Freud would die without knowing their fate, but tormented by worry for them. In London, they welcomed Freud like a king. His house in Hampstead was full of flowers and letters. He was visited by H.G. Wells, Stefan Zweig, and Salvador Dali, who drew a portrait of the dying Freud. But his time had run out. The cancer came back. The tumor punctured his cheek. The smell of rotting became so unbearable that it was impossible to enter the room without feeling nauseous. Freud had to cover the cage of his canaries with gauze, because one bird had died from the smell of his wound. The pain became a constant torture that did not stop for a single second. He could no longer read, he could not speak, and he could not sleep. On September 21, 1939, when the Second World War had already begun, confirming his theory of Thanatos, Freud called his treating doctor, Max Schur. Years ago, they had made a pact. Schur promised not to let Freud suffer pointlessly when the end came. Freud took the doctor's hand and said quietly, "Schur, do you remember our deal? Now this is just torture, and it has lost all meaning." Schur understood. He gave Freud an injection of 3 centigrams of morphine. Freud sighed with relief and fell asleep. 12 hours later, Schur repeated the dose. Sigmund Freud never woke up again. He died at 3 in the morning on September 23, 1939. His body was cremated and his ashes placed in an ancient Greek vase that Marie Bonaparte had given him. What then is his legacy? They often compare Freud with Copernicus and Darwin. Copernicus showed that the Earth is not the center of the universe. Darwin showed that man is not the crown of creation, but an animal. Freud dealt the 3rd blow to human pride. He showed that our ego is not the master in its own house. Today, many of his specific theories, like penis envy or the interpretation of dreams as riddles, are rejected by modern science. But the foundations he laid remain unshakable. We speak his language. When we say words like ego, repression, complex, subconscious, Freudian slip, projection, denial, and libido, we are speaking Freud's language. He changed art, literature, cinema, and the way we raise our children. He gave us the right to talk about our desires and fears. He turned on a light in the basement of the human soul. Even if that light was dim and flickering, and even if he saw monsters there, he was the first one who dared to go down. He was the architect of our dreams and the cartographer of our darkness. If you found this story about the father of psychoanalysis fascinating, please hit the like button and make sure to subscribe to the channel. I would love to read your thoughts in the comments below.